It was a cold morning in early winter when Rajesh stepped off the plane at JFK Airport. He had traveled 8,000 miles from India, carrying only a few bags of clothes, a small amount of money, and an enormous hope in his heart. But there was one thing he carried that was heavier than all of that: fear. Rajesh was 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark eyes full of both excitement and apprehension. He had grown up in a small village, the eldest son of a hardworking family. His father, a farmer, and his mother, a seamstress, had always dreamed of a better life for him, away from the fields, away from the constraints of their small town. When Rajesh had received the news that he had been granted a visa to study in the United States, it had been the culmination of years of hard work. The scholarship to attend college in New York City was his ticket to a brighter future. But there was a problem: he couldn't speak English. He had studied it in school, but it had always been theoretical. He could read a little, write some basic sentences, but speaking? That was an entirely different challenge. How would he survive in a country where the streets, the signs, the people, everything, spoke in a language he could barely understand? The first few weeks were a blur of confusion. Rajesh found himself lost more often than he would have liked to admit. The streets of New York, so much more chaotic and fast-paced than his village, overwhelmed him. The language, the people, the noises, it was all too much. The first time he tried to ask for directions, his throat tightened. He approached a woman at a coffee shop, smiling nervously. "Excuse me, can you help me?" She smiled at him, but her face quickly turned puzzled as Rajesh fumbled with his words. "Where is the subway?" he asked, feeling his cheeks burn with embarrassment. She stared at him for a moment before pointing in the general direction. "Down the street, to the left," she said, clearly struggling to understand him. "Left down, thank you," Rajesh muttered, shuffling away quickly, feeling the sting of failure. His heart sank as he realized how far he was from home, how impossible it felt to belong in this world. Back in his small apartment, Rajesh sat in front of his computer, watching YouTube videos in his native language. But this only reminded him of the gap he needed to bridge. The language barrier felt like a towering mountain that would take years to climb. He missed his family, missed the familiar sights of his village, and worst of all, he missed the ease of speaking his own language, without hesitation. One day, as Rajesh was waiting in line at a grocery store, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the right change, a man stepped in front of him. He was an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair and a warm smile. "You seem a bit lost there, son," the man said, noticing Rajesh's nervousness. His accent was thick, but Rajesh could understand the kindness in his voice. "Yeah, I don't speak good," Rajesh admitted, his words stumbling. The man nodded, unfazed. "It's okay. My name's Tom. I've been in this country for 40 years, and I still don't speak perfect English. But I've learned. It takes time. You'll get there." Rajesh looked up, surprised by the man's words. "Really?" "Really," Tom said with a grin. "I came here from Italy when I was your age. I didn't know a word of English either. But you just keep trying. You learn a little bit every day." Tom spent a few minutes with Rajesh, helping him count his change and offering small tips on how to speak more confidently. Rajesh walked out of the store feeling like a weight had been lifted from his chest. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to him kindly, but something about Tom's words sparked a small flame of determination inside him. Maybe he could do this. But the road ahead was not easy. Rajesh enrolled in an English language course at a community center where he was surrounded by other immigrants who were also struggling to communicate. But even with the classes, the textbooks, and the occasional help from a few friends, progress was slow. The frustration often overwhelmed him. One evening, after a particularly tough class where the instructor had asked him to read aloud and he had stumbled over every word, Rajesh sat in a small park near his apartment, his face buried in his hands. A tear slipped down his cheek, but he quickly wiped it away, not wanting anyone to see his weakness. "I don't belong here," he whispered to himself. "I can't do this." Just then, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was a young woman sitting nearby on a bench. She had short, dark hair and bright, intelligent eyes. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, her accent soft but clear. "You just need to keep going." Rajesh looked up, startled. She smiled, sensing his confusion. "I'm Laura," she said, extending her hand. "Rajesh," he replied, shaking her hand awkwardly. Laura sat down next to him, her smile comforting. "I was in your shoes a few years ago. Came from Brazil. I couldn't speak a word of English either. But it's like learning to walk. You fall, you get back up, and you keep moving." Rajesh listened intently as Laura told him her story. She spoke about her struggles, about the times she had wanted to give up, but how she had pushed through with the help of people like Tom, kind strangers who believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. "Just one word at a time, Rajesh," Laura said softly. "And soon, those words will become sentences. And those sentences will become a story of your own." Days turned into weeks, and Rajesh continued his English classes. He practiced in the mirror, repeating words and phrases. He started using his broken English to communicate with his classmates, who were all kind and patient, understanding that learning a new language was a long process. Then, one day, the opportunity to speak arrived in the most unexpected way. Rajesh was working at a small restaurant as a busboy. It was his first job in the US, and while he felt lucky to have it, the language barrier made everything more difficult. He dropped a tray of dishes, and the restaurant owner, a sharp-tongued woman named Mrs. Parker, scolded him in rapid English. "You can't even clean up without making a mess," she yelled. Rajesh felt his chest tighten. He wanted to explain, to tell her he was doing his best, but the words caught in his throat. Then, without thinking, he spoke, in the halting, broken English that he had been practicing. "I'm sorry," he said, the words slow but steady. I try very hard." Mrs. Parker paused. She looked at him, her expression softening just a little. "You try hard," she repeated, as if testing the sincerity in his words. "Yes," Rajesh said, his voice gaining strength. "I try hard to learn, to speak, to work." Mrs. Parker's face softened. For the first time, she didn't seem angry.
"All right.
Just be more careful next time," she said, her tone less sharp. Rajesh smiled to himself, the words finally coming out, his confidence growing. It was a small victory, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger. Months later, Rajesh stood before his English class, ready to give a presentation. His hands were still sweaty, his heart racing, but this time, the fear was different. It wasn't the fear of not being understood. It was the fear of not doing his best. As he spoke, his voice was steady, his pronunciation clearer than it had ever been. His classmates, some of them from countries all over the world, listened intently. He talked about his journey, how he had come to this country with nothing but a dream, how he had struggled to understand, and how he had slowly learned to communicate, to live, and to thrive. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Then Laura, who was sitting in the front row, gave him a thumbs up. The rest of the class clapped. Rajesh felt a lump in his throat, but it wasn't from fear or sadness. It was from pride. He had done it. He had found his words. He had found his voice. In the years that followed, Rajesh grew not only in his command of the English language, but in his understanding of the world around him. He graduated from college, found a stable job, and even started helping other immigrants who were struggling with language barriers. But no matter how far he went in life, Rajesh always remembered the first time he spoke, the first time he found the courage to speak in a language that wasn't his own. It was more than just learning words. It was learning to believe in himself. And that, Rajesh realized, was the greatest gift of all.